Good afternoon. How are you guys? How many of you all were here maybe a year ago when I gave this talk? I tried to change it up so it wouldn't be the same talk. I have several friends here, including I'm surprised you came to see a Yankee be portrayed, but my friend Tom Penning, and Deanne, but many others as well. But anyway, we're going to talk about the namesake of our county, John Sedgwick, of which you're seeing an image up here. He was nicknamed Uncle John. Many people called him that. That was his one of his nicknames. And he has gotten more than just Sedgwick County, Kansas, named after him, as you'll see at the end. And also, we were talking about this earlier, but 45 Kansas counties are named after Civil War veterans. So we have quite a legacy of Civil War veterans in the Kansas story, and certainly in the Wichita story as well. This is where he was born and raised at Cornwall Hollow in Connecticut, and this is just called the Sedgwick Home. This is where his dream was to end his life. Retirement and all that were to be here at this location, but it would not pan out, even though he went there a time or two during the war on leave. I love this house. All the people who came in here earlier saw my screensaver is a beautiful home, beautiful southern home that I love. But I love old front porches and all that. And the Sedgwick family was quite well off. They were certainly not poor by any stretch. But he dreamed of coming back there. He had an incredible pre-Civil War story. I mean, we're going to talk about him in the Civil War, but he had an incredible pre-Civil War story, of which I've listed out some of it. But look at this. I mean, as far as experience goes, John Sedgwick was kind of unparalleled. He fought in the Seminole War. He was great, exhibited great bravery in the Mexican War. 2 battles in particular he was basically given credit for, bravery and courage. He was in Kansas. In fact, he was in Kansas when the Civil War began, although that's a little bit of a debate because he's at a western fort called Fort Wise. Y'all may know that at the time of Kansas Territory, well, before Kansas statehood, we extended all the way to Denver, right? So I always say, we missed out on the opportunity for the ad campaign, Ski Kansas. The heck, right? So that's disappointing. But other than that, but anyway, he was in Fort Wise, and he'd been all around Kansas Territory, and also, ironically, a name I'm going to mention in a few minutes, he had connections with or saw several famous people, including Jeb Stuart, including a general named Edwin Sumner, Bull Sumner. Then he also was in the Mormon expedition. He fought Native Americans several times and also was involved in some of the removal of the Trail of Tears episode. And then he replaced Robert E. Lee twice. When the Civil War broke out, even though he was an older man, this is when Sedgwick had a moment where he said, you know what, I want to retire. We look back at the Civil War and we have a feel for what it was like, how long it was and how costly it was, but people in his time did not. They couldn't imagine how bad it was going to be. And so Sedgwick had a moment where he said, maybe I go home now. But duty called, and he was a career soldier. And I didn't tell you this. He doesn't have a wife and he doesn't have children. And that probably played into the decision that he made now to say, I'll join. I'll do whatever's needed for the cause. And so he did join, and he rises the ranks quite quickly. Brigadier General, Major General. He'd had a lot of experience. I didn't tell you that he was a West Point graduate, but he was a smart man. And he's going to actually be in the line of the corps commanders of 3 different corps. And I'm going to take this off so I can walk back and see myself what I've written. So I told Eric, it's helpful to me to say to you all, the rank system. Some people like to see this. Some people don't like to see this. But this is the rank system of a soldier in the Civil War. It was very rare that a man would go from the bottom to the top. But you can see how high you can go. Basically, very few people were Major General, and then Grant really is the only one that should be given the title of Lieutenant General. But like I said, Sedgwick came in as a colonel, and so he moves up about 2 or 3 different spots. But then he becomes a corps commander, which when I go to this next slide, hopefully that will make a little bit of sense. This was even more, for me, this is even more important, and that is how are armies situated? How are armies broken down? And so at the bottom you start as a company, and then a regiment. For example, you're the 8th Kansas Company A, and then you move up and you're attached to a brigade, a division, a corps, which is made up of 2 divisions, and finally an army. So Sedgwick is the 2nd. He'll be involved in the 2nd, the 6th, 2nd and the 6th Corps in particular. In fact, most people know him for being the 6th Corps commander. His first real action was in the Peninsula Campaign, 1861, 1862, and this is also where he meets General George McClellan. And George McClellan, known as Little Mac or Little Napoleon, for me, he's a kind of an arrogant guy, kind of full of himself. And this is the first place we see where Sedgwick is duty. Sedgwick does duty. Even when he doesn't agree with his commanders, even when he doesn't like his commanders, Sedgwick does what he's told. Which I was telling this to Eric again before the presentation today. I didn't realize till I reread about Sedgwick this time that he almost was killed really 3 times. Because he kept getting himself in tough spots, because he was a man of duty, but he was also a man of action, so he got himself enveloped and in bad spots multiple times. So honestly, it's a miracle he lived as long as he did. Also, something different from last time when I was here, I read another book about Sedgwick. There's not that many biographies, and they're older. It does make a guy think to himself, hey, maybe I always want to... When I realize a book hasn't been written recently and I keep reading about someone, I go, maybe I'd like to write that. But of course, it takes tons of time. But I really enjoyed this book by Richard Winslow on Sedgwick. It's my favorite. It's balanced. It's really factual, I think, and a lot more primary sources about him, some of which I'll be sharing. But anyway, McClellan, as you all know, was slow. As Lincoln said, he had a case of the slows. As Lincoln also told him at one point, if you're not going to use the army, could I borrow it for a while? So that speaks to Lincoln and McClellan's challenges with each other. Well, Sedgwick had similar problems with McClellan, most notably on several occasions, probably because of politics, this is interesting. McClellan clearly is a Democrat, probably almost a peace Democrat. Sedgwick's politics weren't that clear. He was much more, which is good, it's a positive for him. He put country over politics over time and time again. If anything, he probably leaned Republican, which was Lincoln's party. I think when the war began, he might not have been a Lincoln man, but he was becoming a Lincoln man. I do think McClellan knew that. Not that they fought all the time, but Sedgwick was wondering why McClellan made some of the decisions that McClellan made. And if you've read much about McClellan, all of us in 2015 wonder about some of the decisions McClellan made, meaning they didn't always make sense. So they had that problem amongst themselves. But anyway, the point is, this is where Sedgwick, for the first time, is on the battlefield, and he fights in the 7 Days Campaign. He fights at Malvern Hill, and he does a good job. So forget politics for a minute. People say, hey, you know what? Sedgwick, he's a fighter. And I will say this also about Sedgwick. He's not I just said it, but let me say it again. Politics is invading the army, but it's not invading John Sedgwick very much. He's not talking about politics very much, which, if you're an Abraham Lincoln at this point, you want fighters and not politicians. You all know that McClellan's going to run against Lincoln in 1864. So that makes everybody say, in hindsight, wait a minute, George, did you make some of your decisions of 1862 based upon politics only? I hope not, because if you did, you sacrificed men unnecessarily. So anyway, that's going to be a discussion. I wish some people like Sedgwick would have lived to give us a little bit more of his perspective on that. He was one of the higher-up generals who was near McClellan, and I think he would have had a perspective anyway. The other thing that happens is he gets put under, because a lot of times they'll combine divisions or corps or get them close to each other, especially as the armies move forth. And he gets underneath Edwin Sumner, and I'm not going to go into great talk about him, but his nickname is Old Bull. I love nicknames. I always want to know what everybody's nickname was. I want a nickname. But I want to make sure it's a good one. You know, not like Old Fuss and Feathers or what's the other? There's some other great Civil War nicknames you guys can, I'm sure, think of. But anyway, Sumner was, like the name kind of sounds, he was a tough-nosed guy. Did you know that Sumner, who Sedgwick is about to fight with and under, was the same guy, Sumner, who, after John Brown committed first Pottawatomie Massacre and then the Battle of Blackjack in 1856, it's Edwin Sumner in Kansas territory. Again, it tells you how many of these soldiers, who later will be so important, were in Kansas territory during the Bleeding Kansas period. But it's Sumner who caught up to John Brown and arrested him. right after the Battle of Blackjack. Now, ironically, he released him, which many people say, why did you do that? Well, it's complicated, and at that point they didn't know all that was going on, and they were still trying to keep the peace. But Sumner is a tough-nosed guy, and Sumner sort of reminds me of a Burnside or a Hooker, Joe Hooker, who we'll talk about in a minute. They'll fight, and they'll fight hard, but they're not real smart sometimes. I have a good friend of mine who's a Southern lady, and she'll always say to me that so many of the generals, and she's right, so many of the generals in the first part of the Civil War on the Union side, especially in the East, really make some peculiar decisions, maybe some really bad ones. Dr. Armstrong at Wichita State used to always say that the first 2 years of the war, the Union had its first-team generals in the West, and the Confederate had its first-team generals in the East. And it wasn't until 1864 when Grant got there and Sherman got there and others got there that finally it was first team on first team. And now the battle really was on. And I have to say it seems like that is the case. And then some people say, well, the Union generals got better as the war progressed. And trust me, by the way, there were some poor Confederate generals. There were some that were really, did kind of inexplicable things. But anyway, there's a lot more. I guess my point is this, with McClellan and Sumner and some of these guys, there's some really peculiar decisions from time to time here. And I would just describe it as they were tough, but they weren't necessarily what I would classify as geniuses. They weren't masterminds, strategists here. Okay, so having said that, Sedgwick is going to get underneath Sumner in command. And the only reason I'm saying all that to you is because Sedgwick's life, Sedgwick's corps, Sedgwick's command is going to be at the behest of General Sumner here in a few minutes. And as we all know, it's a very important, significant time in 1862. And so, right after the Battle of Second Manassas, Second Bull Run, Sedgwick falls in with Sumner. And I wanted to find these maps because, and I may go back and forth a little bit, but you guys can see the Union as they're moving forward. This is Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. He's only going to get as far as Antietam or Sharpsburg, Maryland. But this is his first invasion of the North. And here goes Burnside, here goes Sumner, here goes Franklin, and they're all defending. It's always curious in the first 2 or 3 years of the war why the Union soldiers oftentimes are not on the right side of D.C. protecting it correctly. And I could get into that, and I won't, because I don't understand why the Confederates didn't push the advantage a little harder, just like I don't understand why McClellan didn't push the advantage in the Peninsula Campaign a little bit harder, but they didn't. So, but Robert E. Lee is going to go north. It's his first of 2 invasions, right? This is the Maryland invasion. In a year, we're going to have the Pennsylvania invasion. I hope you understand how important that was. First of all, Lee needed the Union to be on the defensive to get him out of Virginia. But secondly, should the Confederacy win a battle in the North, a la Saratoga of the American Revolution, you could ask for foreign aid and you might get it. The Confederacy needed foreign aid. They needed some allies. They didn't have any. And so had either Antietam or Gettysburg gone differently, the war really could have gone differently. But it didn't. So here goes Sumner, and here goes Sedgwick with Sumner. And here's what happened. On the Union left flank, the Union left side, Sumner, now again, give him credit, he's a fighter. But give him discredit, he doesn't understand what's going on. Like a lot of the Union soldiers in Antietam, they get themselves too far forward too fast. They're probably trying to kind of do different than what McClellan had done before. And this is McClellan's here. A lot of people will say this is the only place McClellan really fights, because it is Maryland, because it is home to some extent. But either way, Sumner's column, Sumner's men will get, best way to describe it is if I drew a line, of a Union line, you would see Sumner's guys go way in front of the rest of the Union line. So we've lost coordination here. And by doing that, Sumner gets so far forward, and Sedgwick is in that. He's in that. But getting so far forward, we got Confederate soldiers on 3 sides. So an inverted horseshoe has happened. And Sedgwick is in the middle of it. People are going down like crazy. Guys are going down like crazy. Sedgwick, and no matter what you hear later, give him a lot of credit right here, because Sedgwick was calm. And there's many more, but it was said of Washington, it was said of Lee, it was said of Grant, it was said of Stonewall. You can say it of Sedgwick. Men described him in the heart of battle as being calm. The idea that whether I die on the battlefield or I die in my bed, God knows. Sedgwick seemed to live that. And like I said, give him credit. Now, it'll seem weird later on, but you know what happens to guys like that? Sometimes they aren't worried about their own lives, to be honest with you. So Sedgwick is in that moment. So my point is this: many other commanders would have gone to pieces. Governor Warren and some others will go to pieces at different times when the same thing happens. Sedgwick stood strong. So strong that in the middle of the battle, as he loses 2 or 3 of his junior officers, he says, until we can find a way to get back out of here. And by the way, friendly fire is even happening now. But he says, before I get out of here, we got to make sure it's safe. And so he's waiting for the cue. He's also hoping this line, part of the line, and this part of the line can come up rather than him retreat. Sedgwick gets shot. He's going to get shot 3 times. But I liked this description by General Howard because it gives you a feel for what really happened at Antietam. That 3-line advance had run Sedgwick's division into a trap well set and baited. So he's in a bad spot, and boom, boom, boom. And the first 2 shots are for sure superficial. Not superficial, but they're basically hand and what have you. The 3rd shot, he gets struck in the shoulder. And now he's losing a lot of blood, and quite quickly. And so now they convince Sedgwick, because they've asked him after the first 2 to come back, that they'll try to get him out. After the 3rd time he gets hit, his horse gets shot out from under him as well. The horse is shot and killed. He reaches and tries to grab another man's horse, but then he looks down, he's pouring blood, and quite honestly, he got faint. He's starting to pass out. So that's when he concedes, I'll let you take me off. So they do take him off the battlefield. And he goes home. And guess what? We have another one of these moments where he goes to that beautiful house in Connecticut, and they said that for several weeks he told his sister, I should retire. He's 50 years old. And that's the other thing. He had great stamina. Men described him as being, much, much more energetic than most 50-year-old men. So he had at least a few weeks there where he really considered retiring. But as you all know, the war wasn't going well still for the Union. Although Antietam was a victory, a very costly Union victory, he had that moment. But 3 months later, December of 1862, so he stays home and he 90 days, he basically gets better. And then in December of 1862, he tells his sister, well, they need me. I'm going back. So duty called again. He was going to go back. Had he retired at that point, which he obviously seriously considered, we'd all consider him a great general and a great hero and all that. But anyway, he goes back to war. And now he returns to the 6th Corps. It's a long story, but there was some corps, combining going on and movement of troops. And even a corps could sometimes, there was a couple battles that Sedgwick goes with his entire corps, 20,000 guys plus. And then someone tells him, a higher up says, hey, I'm taking 18,000. So you end up, he described there 2 or 3 battles that he was out there as the corps commander but had command of no one. On the flip side, he might get tossed an extra 10,000 soldiers and then have command of way more than a corps, almost 2 corps. It happened. But he returned to the 6th Corps, and at that point, the new commander, we've gone through 2 or 3, or if you're keeping track, I always tell my students, if you're keeping track, 7 or 8 for the whole war. But anyway, they've gotten to Fighting Joe Hooker, who Sedgwick likes, but I would say he's the same problem as Burnside, a fighter, but maybe not always thinking things through quite well. Although I think Hooker kind of gets a bad rap a little bit, just a little bit. I actually think Hooker might have been superior at times to Meade. But the campaign that's happening at this particular point in time is called the Chancellorsville Campaign. And at the Chancellorsville Campaign, and you all may know this is where Stonewall Jackson is killed by his own men. But I'm going to step out here just so I can read this quote. In the middle of the fight, again, it's a very intense fight. Sedgwick's not going to be injured, but several around him are. They describe one moment, he's got 2 aides next to him, and both of them were killed. So again, I told you there's like 3 times he could have been killed in the war. Antietam is one, Chancellorsville is one, and then what will happen at Spotsylvania. But anyway, one of the aides, one of his junior officers looked at him and said, General, it looks as if the 6th Corps was going to close its career today. And Sedgwick, I told you his nickname's Uncle John, it has somewhat that appearance. Then this aide says, then if the 6th Corps goes out of existence today, I hope it will be with a blaze of glory that will light the history of this war for all time. And then Sedgwick smiled and said, I will tell you a secret, there will be no surrendering. Now that's where Sedgwick looks like Grant. He's not backing up. He's not, and like I said, it's to the point of his own peril. but he will not back up. Most Union officers at this point would have probably, but he would not. I found three or four specific wartime photos of Sedgwick, and this is one of them. He's actually the second from the right, and there's Meade. After the Chancellorsville defeat, Stonewall dies. Sedgwick did well, but the Confederacy wins that battle, and then we're going to talk about the move to Gettysburg. But anyway, now Meade is the commander, and that is a cool picture of Sedgwick. It's difficult to smile in those images, but I think in this picture you kind of see a pleasant-looking man, which people described him as a serious man, but a very pleasant man as well. Should I move Eric a little bit? It looks to be feedback from that guy. I'll come over here and see if it gets better. I need to see this side of the room anyway. As soon as Chancellorsville's over, and many people think that might press the end of the war, Robert E. Lee tries his second invasion of the North. And Sedgwick will say later on the hardest marching that his men did was right after Chancellorsville because, again, you got to get back to defend. And so he and his men go as quick as they can to Gettysburg. And, not that he knew it like we know it, but it is kind of sad. The biggest battle, Antietam's the bloodiest day in American history. Gettysburg's the bloodiest battle in American history. But ironically, when he got to Gettysburg, he was held in reserve. The Union will win, but I think that's an interesting thing. He knew a lot of what was going on. He went to all the meetings, and he did have a lot to do with a retreating action or a moving action afterwards at Rappahannock. But anyway, it's interesting that for all the fighting that he did, the one place where everybody would think he would have really been thrown into the middle of it all, in 3 days, he's really held in reserve that whole time. And again, he's ordering people around somewhat, but he's not in the fight. Here's another photo of Sedgwick here on the right. Now things change. Gettysburg is over, and now Ulysses S. Grant is being promoted because they've decided Grant can get it. Lincoln hopes Grant can get it done. He's right. Too bad he didn't come sooner. But it's the case, and now it's going to be Ulysses S. Grant against Robert E. Lee, and I always think Sedgwick fit Grant. Sedgwick's style fit Grant much better. Not that they're going to have a ton of interaction even now, but they're going to have some. But also a change of strategy is occurring, and that change of strategy is what many historians will call total war, because whereas in the first 2 years of the war, oftentimes a battle is fought and almost with chivalry, which is nice. The armies would almost withdraw and let the dead be picked up and what have you. In the case of McClellan, who's now been dismissed and should have been dismissed, oftentimes he might even win a battle or lose a battle, but then almost go into quarters for 30 days. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee's going everywhere. He's busy. That's McClellan's inefficiencies. But Grant's not that way. When Grant loses, he'll fight the next day, and when he wins, he'll fight the next day, but he'll fight the next day. He's going to stay on it. He's a fighter. The rumor that Abraham Lincoln is told about Grant is that he's a drinker, and Lincoln says, if he's a drinker, find out what brand he drinks so I can pass it out to all the generals. Because all I know about him is he fights. I cannot spare him. He fights. So Grant was the man he needed, and Sherman was the man he needed. And of course, that means also it's rough. It means it's not popular at all. Grant gets the nickname the Butcher, which I don't know that that's fair, because I think at that point several of them are doing that, would have done that to each other. They're going to fight to win. Sherman said that. William Sherman always gets the quote, "War is hell." But to Sherman, like Eisenhower said, when you're in war, you're in it to win it, and you want it to be over with as fast as possible. You don't want to play war. So that's a good, healthy debate, of how that's conducted. But I think that fits Sedgwick's style a little bit more than some. And so, map. I like maps. And this gives you a feel for, and again, I'm going to step here if I can do this. This gives you a feel for the whole scene. Antietam to the top of that map, and then Gettysburg beyond. And then you see here the Wilderness and Fredericksburg. And so the first time in the Grant versus Lee kind of overland campaign elements of it that Sedgwick's going to get thrown into the fight is at the Wilderness. And it's terrible. The Wilderness is a terrible, terrible fight, terribly bloody. This is kind of why Grant gets, not just here, but Cold Harbor is why Grant gets the nickname the Butcher, because so many are sacrificed in so short of amount of time. But Grant believes that he can press the attack and take Robert E. Lee down. And it will take a great general to take Robert E. Lee down, or a great generaling to get him to take him down. But anyway, so Sedgwick is at the Wilderness, and while he's not wounded there, well, he describes his flight from there as a narrow escape. Kind of, again, the idea that he only has one space to go out of, and it's very, very bloody, and it's hard to even know who won. You know, people say, how do you even know who won these battles? Because quite honestly, it's waves going back and forth, and in the end, oftentimes we say whoever left the field. It could be you left because of exhaustion or whatever reason, but when you leave that field, the winner goes to the guy that holds that field somewhat. But it's difficult, like the Wilderness, it's difficult to say, hey, that's a winner. But anyway, so Sedgwick himself gets caught in a kind of a pinch, and he narrowly gets back out. And they say at one point, the Union soldiers are really disappointed. They're really discouraged because they're seeing the death count so high. And they see Sedgwick riding by, and he's smiling. And this quote here, one of the Union soldiers said, "It must be all right. Uncle John is here," which, I mean, that almost sounds like, to save the day. But he became a source of confidence for them that he was going to be there, and he was going to fight, and he was going to say an encouraging word, and so you thought you could fight for another day. And he knew the men needed confidence. They didn't have it. They had not had it under McClellan. Whatever else you want to say about the first two and a half years of the war, Union soldiers in the East did not have confidence that they could win. Sedgwick he understood that. He wanted that to be restored, quite honestly. So we're working our way up here to a kind of a climax. So after the Battle of the Wilderness, now the Union forces are in hot pursuit of Robert E. Lee. And per Grant's, ideas, which again, very different than the Union Army of the 2 years earlier maybe, per Grant's idea is when you put the pedal down, you don't stop at all. And that might mean forced marches, and that might mean night marches, and they did it. And so we've got Sedgwick and his men moving very quickly, and things are kind of blowing up a little bit. And I don't. This is one of those rabbit trails I don't want to go too far into, but you have several generals coming to even Grant and saying, because they're not used to this, and there's been a ton of death. And they even described that as they were leaving areas, they're walking very, very quickly, they're moving quickly, they're riding quickly. There's bodies everywhere. Some of Sedgwick's men said, we never, ever left an area like that before. You stopped long enough to sort some of that out. Not this time. As you left, there were bodies literally everywhere. And Governor Warren, General Warren, said he just came and flat out tried to curse out a couple of his superior officers. And even because they're telling him, we're going to have you connect with him and do this and whatever. And Warren says, basically, I'm not going to quote him because there's a lot of cursing involved. But you can look it up. And what he says is, I won't be connected to anyone. I won't be connected to anyone. I'm taking care of myself. You see what's happening? Because they've seen so much death. He says, look, if it gets out of hand, if it gets crazy, I'm going to take care of myself. Well, you're connected to Sedgwick. Watch what Sedgwick does. He said, I like Sedgwick, but I'm going to take care of myself. That shows you that while they're fighting hard, they're panicked a little bit. They're anxious. And this first comment up here does tell you that even Sedgwick, even the resolute, calm Sedgwick, men said this about him. They said, while he was always calm, he appeared more concerned than usual, and even was riding alongside his men and trying to encourage them. Come on, you guys can hang in there. And he says, we'll get through this. We'll get through here after a while, boys. This won't last always. The enemy has been fearfully punished, so we'll get out into the open country and have a better chance. And they said on several occasions, this is May 7th and May 8th of 1864, they said that when Sedgwick would ride by, men cheered. So again, it's testament to him. Well, by the morning of May 9th, the Battle of Spotsylvania was, and if you guys who are historians of this, this is kind of an ongoing, battle. It's an ongoing fight. There's action almost every day. But on May 9th, the action got really hot. And Sedgwick once again gets in a really, really bad spot, and men are really going down around him. And he tells his men to stay calm, stay calm, stay calm. Midday, warm day, he's with a major named General McMahon. And this is what happens to John Sedgwick. He got mad at his men because they were bouncing around going all over the place. And he wanted them to hold. They were panicking. Remember, the wilderness, it's tough times. And he says, what? Men dodging this way for single bullets? What will you do when they open fire along the whole line? I'm ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. And a few seconds later, Sedgwick was shot in the face, the bullet entering his left cheekbone and entering his brain. He collapsed. He was dead within a minute or so. Famous last line is that one. You know, they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. And I was telling Eric again that this story has always interested me, and so I wanted to read more sources. They do know who they think they know who shot him. One of the men in his command, one of his adjutants, actually rose up and went to the site of the gunfire where he thought it came from, and didn't find several men, because they said one of the weird things was it'd been like boom, 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 lots of bullets, quiet, and then wham, whiz. In fact, one of the men even described a stinging whiz and then Sedgwick down. Anyway, they ran to the spot where they thought that fire came from, and when they did, one of these aides or adjutants saw a very old, gray-headed Confederate soldier with a sharpshooter rifle with a scope. And he killed him. The Union soldier killed the Confederate sharpshooter. I guess we can't know for sure that was the man who fired the shot, but these guys at least believe that was the man that fired the shot. That did happen a couple times in the war. So he was probably felled by a sharpshooter who probably knew who he was and got him, and really did get him. The reaction to Sedgwick's death was astounding. People loved him. General Grant said he couldn't believe it. He said, "Is he really dead? His loss to this army is greater than the loss of a whole division of troops." Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee, men who'd known him before the war and liked him a lot and respected him tremendously, were both incredibly distraught by the news. We can't quite understand how much those men had respect for each other. They knew each other. And so they hoped that the war would pass and they would survive and they could reunite again, of course. And if you didn't know, he's the highest-ranking Union officer who was killed in the war, and one of 3 corps commanders who was killed also in the war. These may be just a little bit dark, but this is the location at Spotsylvania where he was killed. Just a couple different images of that. I was trying to find some of the things that were said about. There were a lot of nice things said about him, but I thought this was one thing that really grabbed me. Here's a man, like I said, he was basically married to the military. He spent his entire life in the service of our country. And someone said when he died that he was one of the truest souls I ever knew. And he went on to say many more other kind things about him. Was he a military genius? I don't think he was. And that's not to knock him. But he wasn't the strategist of a Grant or a Sherman or any of those kind of guys. But what he was he was always there. He was always there. Every time his country called, he was there. And so many people described him as steadfast, courage beyond belief, loyal always to our country and to its causes and concerns. He had money. I think that's one thing that sometimes people say, well, these officers, they had this and they had that and they had a pleasured life. Yeah, they did. And they actually didn't need to fight. And that's something we forget. He didn't need to. It wasn't like today, no offense, but it wasn't like today where you say, hey, my time runs out in 22 years, my time runs out in 12 years. Not that that's a bad thing, of course. But you understand, there was any day he could have resigned in that war. He could have said, I'm going home. I've done my time. And I'm going to end this. And he never did. He wanted to see the thing through. And I have no doubt that probably when the war ended, he probably would have retired, although I don't know. The other thing about people that people described him as is having energy way beyond his, much better than his years. So who knows, if they'd have tried to send him west, he might have come. He'd been out here a lot. He was one of the most traveled generals or traveled commanders in American history as far as in that period, for sure. I'm not done. I got a little clip or two I want to show you guys, and I want to take your questions, and I got a couple more things to say. But we're not the only place that's named after him. And I got to tell you, and you may know differently, and if you do, talk to Eric Kale or myself, but we don't, as to who suggested the county name, there's quite a discussion, yeah.
I'm from Sedgwick.
The town.
I've done some history, and it's founded by people who were, not high up as he was, but under his command.
Yeah.
One of them was Schaefer. I was going to ask you if you didn't run across that name, but he was, and they admired him so much that they named him. Because we were all one county,
Yeah.
A long time ago, I don't know how many people know that.
Yeah.
But this should have all been, Sedgwick was the main town in this whole area. And those people that founded it admired him so much because they were under his command. So that's what I read.
Yeah, there was a tremendous admiration for him. I just was saying, I don't know that there's one specific person who said, I want it to be this guy, this name, but there were several people. He was very admired, and like I said, there's lots of streets and schools and all those locations named after him. Just kind of for fun, did you know that Dances with Wolves has a fictitious fort named Fort Sedgwick that did not exist? I know that's hard to believe that Dances with Wolves is not historically accurate, but it's not completely historically accurate. I mean, I want all those movies to be historically accurate because they're really good, and but not always. Well, Sedgwick would be taken, his body would be taken back to Connecticut and buried there in his hometown and near his home, where he was a hero. And I wanted to, I won't say end because again I'll take your questions, but the last film that I just finished, it just so happens our last section, so this is a spoiler. It's about 10 minutes long. But I want to play it for you because I think it has a lot to do with what people in this region thought or who they were, which was Union soldiers, and in many cases, why we have 45 counties named after, Union officers, Union soldiers. And they're not just officers. Some of our counties are named after privates who was a friend, that you cared about or whatever. So I'm going to try to play this, and then I'll take your questions.
Just at the moment the war was ending, it was also moving west. The West had no north or south, just opportunity. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged the movement west. The promise of 160 acres if a settler could homestead and improve their land for 5 years was a strong enticement. An opportunity made stronger by the fact that Union soldiers could subtract time from the 5 years for every day they served. They came by the thousands. Most of the migrants to Kansas came from Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. By the 1880s, Kansas was known as the Soldier State. Union veterans formed a fraternal organization in 1866, the Grand Army of the Republic, known as the GAR, was an influential organization in America. The GAR fought for pensions and support for the veterans and their families. In communities across Kansas and the Midwest, they gathered and remembered their fallen comrades. The war had long since ended, but as the years passed, the need to be together grew stronger. The brotherhood was strong and shared a bond that only they could fully comprehend.
Who are we? What does it mean to be American? That is the idea that gives birth to Kansas. And that is why Kansas has been not only the geographic center of the United States, but the heart and soul of the United States yet today. Because we defined it, what it means to be American. This is where we hashed it out and decided, right here. And Kansans, I honestly believe, are the quintessential Americans. When people in Europe think about an American, what they're picturing is a Kansan. And it's a powerful legacy.
I think the biggest mistake that when we look at history today, I see it with younger people, even just people in general, that they view history back then in light of their opinions of today. You can't do that with history. You've got to look at it in the times of these people. You've got to look at it for what happened to them. And these are good, honest people back then. They don't want war, but then war changes people. And it changed both sides dramatically. And how we came back, to follow on your last question, we came back to Atlanta civility. That's amazing that we did, because of all the war and bloodshed that happened, and particularly in the state of Missouri at this time. I guess the good Lord finally smiled upon us, is all I can say.
There's a song in my heart. If I just feel the wind, it will start. There's a song where the sun shines like gold. Through the hardships of life, sorrow and strife, and the wearisome heartache and pain. Through the battles hushed down this glorious road to a land where the sun shines again. There's a land that I know where my brothers in battle will call friend and foe, where the sun shines like gold.
We must all cherish Old Glory.
We were young, we were brave, on the road to our home or the grave, passing bright, and that light shines like gold. Through the hardships of life, sorrow and strife, and the wearisome heartache and pain. Through the battles I strode down this glorious road to a land where the sun shines again. Life returns, years have passed,
Let's teach us to walk.
Where they'll stay.
We must tell the world the story. When the boys of the mill are gone. And I'll be seeing you soon, boys.
When we were doing the film, this is our film called The Road to Valhalla, and it just won what's called a Wrangler Award, Western Heritage Award at the Cowboy Hall of Fame, which is cool because it's about Kansas and Missouri. But what I wanted to tell you is this next 3 minutes, which I couldn't figure out where to put it. I called a postscript, but I searched. We have images of veterans, but here we are going to see for 2 or 3 minutes video of veterans, and you don't know it, but there's a couple Kansas veterans in this video. And so I want to play it because video is hard to come by of Civil War veterans, but it existed, and this was these guys. So just play maybe a couple minutes here.
Morning sunlight through the trees, my song sails on the summer breeze, repeating every word I said like running water through my head. Even as I ramble, closer to my home. I can't forget the things I saw, the lonely years I fought this war, the lives of friends I left behind, they were present in my mind. Even as I rambled, I see them now in my mind's eye, the lonely years begin to fly. I take her warm in my embrace, lonely years just slip away. Even as I ramble, I've seen trouble and I bear a heavy load. Since I started out to roam, but every step I take along this dusty road brings me closer to my home.
To me, that's who we are. Who we were is who we are, and that's who we are. There were those veterans that established our community and kept our country alive together. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
That video that you had, are those actual, is that actual footage? of
Yeah,
veterans?
that's actual veterans.
How old is it?
Well, there's about 3 or 4 different, the 1913 might have been the earliest one, and then there was a couple, I think, of the clips that were maybe as late as 1930, 32. Well, they're around. Library of Congress is one place, but I actually, I got at least 1 or 2 of those. I bought like 7 or 8 different films, or got rights to, I should say. But I ended up using 3 or 4. But there's a couple of states that had, I found a couple in state repositories that were really, really good. I had a much harder time figuring out how to get it cleanly to that form. And then I changed the speed of it a little bit too. But yeah. I wanted to see their faces. I had to find a way to put it in the film. Some people say, well, it doesn't make any sense right there. And I was like, well, it's going in. If I have to force it in, I want to see their faces. That's who they were. It's neat to see them. Yeah.
Did Sedgwick complete the facility in western Kansas that he was constructing?
Did who?
Did he complete that?
You talking about Fort Wise or?
Yes, please. What was the name of it?
Fort Wise. Somebody might know better than me. Its existence was only a few years, and I want to, don't quote me, but it was, I want to say 4 or 5 years it was in service. I almost want to say 57 to like 62, but that's just my memory, and I could be wrong. But it was only in existence a few years. There were lots of forts. I gave a talk last summer on the forts in Kansas, and I'm sure you know that, but there were a lot of frontier forts in Kansas that just did not make it. So, yeah, Eric?
The letter we have on exhibit upstairs in the Spirit of Wichita exhibit from Sedgwick recommending Jeff Stewart.
Yeah.
What fort was that written from? Do you recall?
I'm going to have to look again, because that could be Fort Wise, but they were at Riley. They were at Riley and they were at Leavenworth. Leavenworth was, of course, the hub. Leavenworth was the biggest city in Kansas before the war. Lawrence was second. Of course, things will change. But so I know they were at Riley together, or around the same time. Wise at the end for at least Sedgwick. I don't know that I recall Stewart ever being there, but I'll have to look too. I don't know. They went through several. Of course, they went through forts sometimes were there a very short time. But I didn't say this probably real well at the beginning of the presentation, but part of the reason Sedgwick wanted to get out of the military was he was tired of being in the middle of nowhere. You know how that is. They kept putting him in these godforsaken places, and nothing was happening. And he because that's things that he wrote about right before the war, which was that I'm tired of being basically a babysitter to a bunch of recruits. He didn't say that like necessarily in error of the recruits, but he was ready to go home. He just didn't feel like he was doing anything productive. So I'm sure that had a play in why, in the Civil War, he knew it was very, very productive, very important that he be around. I do have some my book up here and some DVDs if you're interested, and if you have any other questions, you can certainly ask me after we go. And thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say real fast. I was from Sedgwick, but I really didn't know anything about him. But my mother was from New Jersey and New York, and we were traveling around to West Point, and we were traveling along the river, and there was this gigantic statue, a beautiful outlet. And I made my husband stop because I thought, man, this is going to be somebody so important because it was just the most beautiful spot, and it's for General Sedgwick.
Yeah.
I was just like so surprised.
Yeah, there are several statues. I'm so glad you stopped me because I forgot a very important story. I was about to get there. Now I'll have to come over here. You can't go just yet. I can't let you go yet. I'll just let you see it like this. One big difference from the last time I've only given 2 Sedgwick talks. I've read about Sedgwick for years, but last summer and then this one. I went to West Point last year. Our film got to screen in New Jersey and New York and Pennsylvania. In fact, that's I just talked about this morning. I went to a church group and spoke, but the guy was asking about interesting moments, and I said, well, last summer I was in a theater in New York with 225 New Yorkers watching a film about Kansas history, and I was sitting in the back thinking, this is going to be really interesting when this is over. How will New Yorkers react to Kansas history? But anyway, I was on my way to those screenings, and I had to go to West Point. I'd been in the area before, but had never gone on at the United States Military Academy. Anyway, there's a statue of Sedgwick at West Point, and you all may know this, but the cadets during finals week go out, and I was told while I was there by a cadet that they'll oftentimes even stand in line because so many of them will do it, and they will spin the spurs on his heel for good luck. This helps them to pass their classes. So I don't know if you know that, but we don't have anybody, unfortunately my students don't have any spurs to spin. But so I had to get to West Point, and then I had to get to Sedgwick statue, and I had to spin his spurs. And it was really cool because we went up there with a cadet and who had done that and was telling me their story of spinning the spurs. Because I said, is it true? Is this just folklore? Oh no, we do it. Trust me. You should come here finals week. You'll see them all walking over there. They're just making their pilgrimage to spin his spurs. Then they don't have Sedgwick to blame when they fail. Thank you very much.